Hi, friends. I hope that you're having a wonderful day today. My name is Luciano. The background for this video is fairly bare just because I mostly want to just chat for a little bit. Specifically, I'm going to chat about what it is about Jumpchains that I like. I don't know how interesting this video is going to be to other people, but I think that it is nice to take this end of the year moment to reflect upon my favorite hobby and what it is that I love about it so much. Before we get going anywhere else, I'm going to take a beat to briefly describe what a jump chain is. A jump chain is a subtype of choose your own adventure in which the basic premise is that the protagonist, the jumper, is a person who is going on a journey from setting to setting. Usually, these journeys last a decade, although this can be shorter or longer depending on drawbacks and perks that someone has and someone takes. And over the course of this journey, they get new abilities, they get new knowledge, they get new items, they get new friends, and they get overall more experience using the different abilities that they get. Oftentimes, though not always, a jumper is someone from some variation of the Earth that you and I live in. A world where there are no superheroes, no superpowers, and they get chosen by a random omnipotent being who usually is bored, although this does not have to be your benefactor's motivation at all, and you don't even need a benefactor if you don't want one. But usually they are bored and they want to see someone go on adventures, so they select the protagonist for reasons that are either entirely random or just because they like the protagonist or some sort of inscrutable motive that the jumper may never see. The jumper goes on journeys that last about a decade each in each of these settings, and then they collect powers, they get all this sort of cool stuff, and they move to the next setting. Normally, the end goal is to spark, which will allow them to, at minimum, travel throughout the multiverse or the omniverse without being stuck to the standards and rules of their benefactor and the structure of a jump chain. So they can go to a setting and they can stay there for a few minutes, or they can stay there for a few thousand years without worrying about some sort of artificial limit. I am someone who has deeply loved jump chains pretty much the entire time that I have learned about them. There are multiple reasons for this, some of which are just me being geeky and loving my own roots as a writer, and others of which relate to my health and other things like that. I want to take this moment to go ahead and chat about those things. I've been writing to some extent in some way almost my entire life. I turned 30 this year, and I wrote my first stories when I was about 8. And as a child, my parents encouraged my creativity. And my mom told me so much to this day that when we talk, she sometimes jokes about it, that she would see something, we would see something together, and she would look at me and she'd be like, that'd make a good story. And the very first stories that I wrote were crossover, sort of fan fiction y stories about video games and TV shows that I really liked, where I inserted myself into those stories and I was a character in those stories. I remember very specific examples involving Wings Club, Star Wars, and just a dozen other things, and it never worked as a story, but it was so much fun. I also remember that as a kid, when I was living in Colombia, because my family is a military family, so I was raised all over the Americas, I had a really good friend who was also an American, and we lived in a neighborhood where there were a bunch of other Americans and also some fairly wealthy Colombians. And we would hang out every day. I was homeschooled and he wasn't. But after school, I would go to his house and we would get on his trampoline and we would play an imagination game where we had the powers and abilities of characters from the things that we were enjoying. I lived in Colombia for about 3 years, and partway through my time in Colombia, Star Fox Assault came out, and we would play it together, and we would pretend that we were on Ara Wings and that we were friends with Fox and Crystal. and that we were going on these adventures fighting off characters from like Star Wars and shit. And like it sounds hilariously goofy and childish now, but in very real ways, that is kind of the basic conceit of a jump chain. You can go to a Star Fox jump chain. You can go to Star Fox Adventures, which is a jump chain that I made. You can get Crystal as a companion, and you and her and Fox can all be friends, and you can go to Star Wars. You could use technology from Star Fox and the gang and Lilat against clone troopers. And I think it's so funny that in a very real way, I have made my childlike dreams come true. Someone else created a very good jump for Wings Club, and I've never actually used it in a chain just because of how hilariously strong Wings Club actually is when you like try to get into like the lore and the power scaling of it all. And my jumpers have always been like my serious jumpers have always been really paranoid and taken everything really seriously. So they have not actually gone to the fun settings aside from the jumpers that I sketch out in my head, which go on very different chains where it's like, oh, they have creative mode or they have questing mode. So because of that, they're able to like take on different tasks. But I try to create jumpers that are bog standard every once in a while. My YouTube chain, which to this day remains my favorite thing I've ever done on YouTube, had a jumper who was normal. They were Luciano, so they were me at the time that I was filming it, but they were a regular jumper who didn't have any of the wacky things. Towards the end of the chain, we started to get a little bit more experimental with those kinds of rules, but for the most part, they went through like 7 or 8 jumps where they were completely normal. They followed all the rules. They had a budget. They had to take on drawbacks. And that was incredibly fun, but it definitely, that jumper would have waited a ton of jumps before they eventually did something like go to Wings Club or whatever. Although that jumper would have had a great time in Star Fox Adventure, which I had not made at the time that I was making those videos, because at the time that I was making those videos, I had only done a few jumps. Now I've done over 70, at least if you count my out of context supplements, which I do. So that's very fascinating to me. But I do think it's so funny that as an adult, I have created ways to live out the sort of fantasies and like imagination games that I would spend hours indulging in as a kid. And that didn't just stop when I was living in Colombia either. When I was a little bit older, I moved back to North Carolina and I had a next door neighbor who was a really good friend of mine. And the two of us also did imagination games. We also played video games and stuff. But my neighbor was like, I think she was like 2 or 3 years younger than me. So rather than play video games, we would often go outside and we would explore our neighborhood and we would play imagination games as well. So I think it's fascinating that my entire life I've really had one consistent thing that I've like stuck with and come back to. And even though I had obviously stopped doing that as an adult, it's very fascinating that it somehow managed to creep its way back into my life. Speak on something that's definitely related to my propensity for imagination games and this kind of crossover thing, but my health is not good. I I try not to talk about this abundantly because it's a real bummer and I try not to be a real bummer when I can help it. But for multiple years my health has been bad. So as a child, I wasn't disabled or chronically ill, but towards the end of my high school experience, I had a couple of bad accidents with my knee that I never fully recovered from. When I was living in Honduras, I injured my knee twice, and when I was living in Honduras was the later end of my high school years. I injured my knee doing sports in both cases. In one case, I was dancing, and in another case, I was doing karate, and my knee never fully recovered. And because of that, when I went into college, I was already definitely disabled, but I was in denial about it. And shortly after I graduated from college, a couple of years later, I was in a car crash that left me permanently disabled. my knee is not good. And while physically it seems to have recovered from what happened to some extent, I have a pain based disability where when I walk, I feel a significant amount of pain. I can walk, like physically, I can do it, but whenever I do it, I'm not having a totally hot, super cool time. I'm always in pain. And I don't really remember what it's like to not feel at least mild pain. So as you can see, that's something that I try not to talk about a huge amount in my videos. I'll mention it, but it's a real bummer. And beyond that, I also have a chronic illness that I am just never going to fully recover from. I don't have the demonetization virus, but I do have something that makes it difficult for me to eat food regularly and for me to like be as engaged as I would like to be because my stomach is constantly in pain. And I've sort of learned to live with that, but there are to this day nights where I will wake up in the middle of the night and feel like I'm about to be sick. And obviously, these two things together have had a significant impact on my life. And I don't want to go into detail about that in this video because it's not really the focus. But because of that, I'm sure if you think about it for a few seconds, you can sympathize with why it is that I like the idea of going on these adventures where my health is better and where I have a body that isn't constantly betraying me. I think that that definitely makes some level of sense. I think it's perfectly logical for me to be like, yeah, man, I find solace in the idea that there is an alternate universe where there is a version of me who was sick but got better. And in exchange for suffering for all of these years, in exchange for going through all of these sleepless nights, where I felt like sometimes I could barely even breathe, or if I did anything, I would be sick. I can instead go on adventures where I can fly and I can be a deity who helps people and I can go and meet all of my friends from my favorite stories from when I was a kid. Like, yeah, it sounds silly, but these little things offer great solace to people when you've been in pain so much that you literally can't remember what it's like to not feel any level of pain. And I think that there is a healthy level of escapism in this community that a lot of us really like, that we really think about, because I know of multiple jump chain creators, some of whom are honestly fairly significant, who either had chronic health issues or have chronic health issues. There's many members in the community where our health on our best days is only enough where we can get out of bed. So I think it makes sense for us to find community and find hope in the idea that maybe someday some random being will be like, hey, I can give you a new body and you can have health and you can go on these awesome adventures. Yeah, like to me, that makes perfect intuitive sense, you know? One of the final, like, really big things that I think about often is the fact that I am a queer person. I I don't super want to go into the specifics of all of this just because people are always weird when I say it, but I am a trans person and I am asexual, and in the community of jump chains, there's lots of different stuff that is very fun to look at as a queer person, especially if you are a queer person with, like me, a funny gender identity. The ability to sort of roll a dice to select your gender is very funny to me. The ability to roll a dice to select your sex is something that always makes me laugh. And while this isn't as common in newer jumps, I've definitely read through hundreds of older jumps where there were either elements of choice for determining your gender or you could just sort of pay to change it, and to me that's real. I recognize that and I always find it funny. But there are a lot of other members of the community who told me, in some cases they didn't realize that I was also like a trans person, but there's also other members of the community who've messaged me and just been like, yeah, man, I really like I really like going and getting like the essential body mod because then I get to go and just sort of pick and choose my gender and sex. And like whenever someone asks me that, one of my first reactions is always to ask them if they are LGBT like I am. And they will almost invariably say yes. And I really love that there's so many queer people in the community. Not every single person who is like an active maker is queer, obviously, but it's fun. It's really nice that this is just a community where, through happenstance, a lot of non conforming, agender, and trans people are all able to just sort of come together and be like, hell yeah. This is my escapist fantasy. And I really like that. It fills me with a level of joy that most of my hobbies and most of the spaces I'm in don't really get to fill me with the same way. So I'm always delighted whenever I get to hear about another person in the community who is LGBTQ in some respect and gets to tell me the level of joy they feel whenever they find a document where it's like, oh yeah, you don't have to worry about like gender or sex stuff. Um, I very famously said this to Ratter, who is the creator of the other Harry Potter fanfiction Jump, and also the creator of the Drove the Underdark Jump, because they included a section in their other Harry Potter fanfic Jump that is just like, hey man, gender stuff, whatever. And they also included one in their Drove the Underdark Jump as well, and I really love both of those. I really love both of those just in general because those are perks that even if I don't find them necessary, I would always snatch up. I also always snatch up shapeshifting perks whenever I can get them, especially free form shapeshifting, because I just really love the idea that I will get to pick my gender and sex each day. And if I really feel like not being the me that I am when I wake up, I can just change that with a snap. That is something that is just such a like wholesome queer fantasy of mine that it's very funny that this particular imagination game is what allowed me to really live it out. I create a lot of jumps that are very interesting in that respect just because I create Troyverse things. And Troyverse things are often harem, not safe for work stuff. And it's very fun because Troy, the creator of that universe, is super wholesome when it comes to this kind of stuff. He's just like, hey, I write my stuff a very specific way. You absolutely don't have to play it this way. It is Omega canon that gender and sex can be whatever you want. It's just that I am the way that I am, and I'm writing these as a thing for me and sharing them as a thing for you. And I love that attitude. It is so wholesome. Again, those jumps tend to be not safe for work, but if you do want to look at them, you certainly can. They are in my drive, which I link in all of my videos. That said, if you go look at the original source material, you should know ahead of time. Take to heart the things that I've said because it is very male centric and there's lots of women there. But again, the whole point of it is to live it out how you want to live it out. It's just that the person who created it, is a male who likes women, is a man who likes women. So you're going to see a lot of that kind of thing. But if you don't mind that and you like the fantasy, super cool. Super happy to introduce that to you. That said, hilariously not safe for work, and the ones that are safe for work are marked as such in my drive. All of my jumps that are from specific web content like Choose Your Own Adventures have links in them, so you can always find the source material in all of my like choose your own adventure things or in all of my like web content things. I've made jumps for the Lost in the Hyperverse Backrooms continuity and the Return to Render Backrooms continuity, both of which are huge web things, and I have links to them there. So just go ahead and take a look at that if that's what you're into. But I definitely think that the reasons why I like Jumpchains make sense. I feel like it is not at all difficult for someone to understand why it is that someone who is physically disabled, who has always loved writing and imagination games, and is themselves a trans person, would be super fascinated by Jumpchains, which are imagination games and writing prompts that have huge crossover elements that let you fantasize about being a superhero and having a healthy body and that are super queer friendly, at least for the most part. There's some that aren't, but there are so many jump documents and jump creators that are queer friendly that it's just really nice that this community has been so wholesome and affirming, and I'm so honored and happy to be a part of it. I'm also so delighted that I've been able to introduce so many people to jump chain things. I've been getting more and more messages, and I've been seeing different things online from people who are just like, oh yeah, my first exposure to this sort of stuff was Luciano. And I'm just like, that's goofy to me. But I'm so happy that I could be your entry points to this wonderful imagination game and writing prompt. And I can't wait to introduce many more people to it. I hope that you all are having a truly wonderful holiday season. I hope that you will allow me to celebrate it with you. I am still going to be making videos. I am probably going to be continuing my trend of one video a week until the start of the new year, but you all should expect to see me next week. I am delighted to be even a small part of your holiday, and I hope that you are having a wonderful day. Until the next video, I will talk to you all later. Bye bye, everyone.